Yeah. Well, the counteroffensive has begun. This was the subject of months of hype, all these breathless predictions. People like General David Petraeus saying that Ukraine's going to deliver a knockout blow to Russia, and the offensive is going underway. And by all accounts, if people could correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't look like it's going very well for Ukraine. They took a few farming villages in Donetsk, I believe, that apparently are not very significant and might have even have been abandoned. I'm sure, obviously, there were some areas where they killed some Russians, which is the one of the aims. But overall, there are just so many accounts, even in Western media, which is normally incredibly jingoistic and just on board with the proxy war, just admitting that this is not going well. So, for example, this is one account in the Washington Post. I'll just read like the first few paragraphs. Hear this. The men of Ukraine's 37th Brigade were freshly trained and armed with Western supplied weapons, tasked with an initial push through Russian-occupied territory in the early days of a long-awaited counteroffensive. They would pay a heavy price. Within 20 minutes of their June 5th advance in the southeast Donetsk region, mortars exploded all around them, soldiers said. A 30-year-old soldier known as Lumberjack saw two of the men in his vehicle bleeding heavily. One lost an arm as he cried out for his family. Lumberjack crawled into a crater, but the shrapnel from a mortar went through the soil and pierced his shoulder. We were left there in the field without tanks or heavy armor, he said. We were shelled with mortars from three sides. We couldn't do anything. There were fewer than 50 men in the unit, he said, and 30 did not return. They were killed, wounded, or captured by the enemy. 5 of the unit's armored vehicles were destroyed within the first hour. So that's the Washington Post, an account of just one unit. But by all the accounts that I've seen, that's kind of the emerging picture so far, at least.
Well, I've been watching closely, Aaron, as to gain a barometer on how well the counteroffensive is doing. I've been watching corporate media closely because these outlets and the correspondents who are now embedded in Zaporozhye would gain libidinal satisfaction and joy from any Ukrainian advance. And so far, they have been politically and psychologically cock-blocked by the reality on the ground. I saw a report by CNN's Fred Fleitgen, who's their correspondent there, and he wasn't able to report any advances by the Ukrainians. And then they instead turned to one major victory in this counteroffensive. It was unbelievable. One single Russian soldier near Bakhmut allegedly surrendered to a drone. So they focused their entire segment on one Russian soldier retreating while being monitored by a drone. And I don't even know if that story is accurate, but that was the victory that they could claim on CNN. And this came after hours and hours and hours of Trump indictment coverage, which is something they can be a little bit more excited about. And then you have the Washington Post. You have Reznikov, the defense minister of Ukraine, making some noises about negotiation. I don't know if that's to pressure his Western patrons into delivering more weapons. You have Putin at the St. Petersburg, at a major conference in St. Petersburg yesterday, declaring that we are burning Leopard tanks and we will burn the F-16s. And the Pentagon spokesman is refusing to answer questions from members of the Beltway Press Corps about how many Bradley fighting vehicles were lost. However, the Pentagon has just allocated a new $325 million shipment of Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine to replace those that are gone. And here you have my tweet where I note that according to CNN, 15% of all Bradley fighting vehicles supplied to Ukraine were destroyed in pretty much one day, 1 or 2 days. And so we have to pay out of pocket to replace these. Scott Ritter, who's, former Marine intelligence officer, UN weapons inspector, has been on this program before, gave a 3-hour interview to the Duran. I don't know how he does it. Scott's on he's on all the time. I want whatever he's taking. And I don't know how he doesn't lose his voice, but it was a brilliant interview in which he explains that the Bradley fighting vehicles being supplied to the Ukrainians, first of all, are Desert Storm era Bradley fighting vehicles. They're not the newest ones, but they're much more difficult to learn and to take out into the field and to then repair than the Soviet era and Russian made fighting vehicles that the Ukrainian military is accustomed to, and that they may not even know how to use these. In Scott's overall analysis is this is a NATO counteroffensive. It's a combined arms counteroffensive directed by NATO, testing out NATO weaponry. And he believes that the Ukrainians have been cursed by NATO to have all of this supposedly advanced Western weaponry imposed on them that they don't necessarily know how to use. They've only had a few months to learn. Whatever we're seeing in the field appears, I mean, this is Scott's view. It's not, I don't have the military wherewithal to say this, but in Scott's view, there is zero chance of the counteroffensive succeeding. So far, they have not penetrated the outer lines of heavily fortified Russian defenses. And this is the Russian forte of lines and lines of dug-in defenses. I mean, it's a country that has been under siege for centuries. This is their defense doctrine at its core, and Ukraine is going into the heart of it. I was reading earlier today some self-styled military experts on Substack. One guy named Goya, who's a former Marine, who had kind of charted out their ideal Ukrainian counteroffensive, what it would look like. And it would be heavily dependent on what they called lightning strikes with drones and air power, as well as the fires, artillery strikes, softening up Russian positions, then sending in sappers to take out the lines. None of that's happening because their air power, to the extent they had any, particularly their drones, has been neutralized by Russian anti-aircraft defenses. So it's looking so far disastrous. And what does this mean politically? It means, well, there are two ways of looking at it. One, I think it's obvious. It's very much like I would draw a parallel to Aleppo, Aaron, where it was kind of the last stand of the Al-Qaeda aligned Turkish, NATO, and Gulf-backed forces in East Aleppo, in 5 districts in East Aleppo in around like September 2016. Turkey kind of pulled the plug on them. They stopped sending in the weapons. They were encircled by the Syrian Arab army with Russian support. And that pretty much spelled the end of the dirty war and forced a negotiation that the West just refused to participate in through Astana. So it was that was it. And I think this may be it as well. Although, of course, the West and Secretary of State Tony Blinken, no matter what, have no intention of negotiating or pulling back. And when I say this is it, I mean that Ukraine will have to decide. They have 12 brigades left. Do they want to erode the rest of their military and allow Russia to possibly push forward to Odessa and Kharkiv and take all of eastern Ukraine, which would happen if their military completely collapsed? Or do they want to start some kind of process? And if the counteroffensive succeeded, first Anne Applebaum would have continuous orgasms for days and days and days until she had to be hospitalized. And then second, the war would continue for years because it would create a pressure cooker around Crimea, and it would possibly escalate. I mean, we'd be talking about tactical nuclear weapons then. So the failure of this counteroffensive is good for negotiations, in my view. I don't know if it will fail. I don't know as much as Scott or others, but so far it doesn't seem to be going that well. And Aaron, I mean, it doesn't look like Tony Blinken cares either way.
No, this is what Tony Blinken said recently. He laid out basically the U.S. vision for the war in a recent speech in Finland. The vision was basically no diplomacy with Russia, no ceasefire, and just no matter what happens in this counteroffensive, just permanent conflict and arming Ukraine to the teeth. And just to contrast what the picture Max laid out about the state of Ukraine's military in this counteroffensive with what Blinken says here, which seems to me so out of touch with reality. Listen to what he says about Ukraine's military.
By virtually every measure, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a strategic failure. The Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine. The United States welcomes any initiative that helps bring President Putin to the table to engage in meaningful diplomacy. We'll support efforts, whether by Brazil, by China, or any other nation, if they help find a way to a just and lasting peace, consistent with the principles of the United Nations Charter.
Yeah, and what he means by that is, as long as we'll support any peace proposal that gives Ukraine all of its territory back, including Crimea, which, again, we all know the history, historically a part of Russia. Russia seized it after the 2014 US-backed Maidan coup, and it's never giving it back. So basically, Blinken is saying no peace. And that line he has about how, many people thought that Russia had the second strongest army in the world, but actually it's the second strongest army in Ukraine. It's so delusional. And just look at now the picture we're getting from the counteroffensive so far, where all these Ukrainian forces infused with Western training and equipment are getting seriously decimated, at least by the accounts that we've seen. And that's after, of course, so many soldiers on the front lines for Ukraine had to suffer because Ukraine was holding back its troops and its equipment to prepare for this counteroffensive. And there's a recent article in the New Yorker by Luke Mogelson, who deployed with a Ukrainian battalion on the front lines. And the picture he paints was so dire. And that was before this counteroffensive. And there's even a line from some top Ukrainian official where they said, speaking of the soldiers fighting as they were preparing for the counteroffensive, like, they'll have to forgive us because we need to pull back and prepare for the counteroffensive. And now they had the counteroffensive, and at least from what we can tell, it's just not going very well. And the vision for Blinken and Newland, and this has been laid out, in Blinken's speech and in all these articles that have come out, in just talking to established media outlets like the Washington Post and New York Times, it's just basically turning Ukraine into Israel, perpetually in conflict with its neighbors, no comprehensive peace agreement. So, Russia laid out this really sweeping draft treaty in December 2021 with all of its grievances, NATO expansion, NATO military infrastructure surrounding Russia. And Russia simply said, we want you to roll it back to the pre-1997 levels before there was this new round of massive NATO expansion. And also address the fact that you have these missile sites in Poland and Romania that are aimed at Russia. These U.S. missile sites. And the U.S. basically wouldn't talk about pretty much any of Russia's proposal, except for narrowly on a couple of issues, but even there with caveats. And I don't see how the Biden administration will somehow reverse that position. Like, if they wouldn't talk to Russia to prevent the war, I don't see how they could go and do it now, because that would look, quote unquote, weak. And so this basically just means permanent frozen conflict with Ukraine just basically being used as a bulwark and increasingly militarized, and maybe some occasional skirmishes, but just no peace agreement at all, whether it's certainly between the U.S. and Russia. That to me is just off the table.
Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, delivered a press conference from NATO headquarters about 48 hours ago, where he said that we cannot judge the success of Ukraine's counteroffensive, but he has suggested in his speech that the success of this counteroffensive was contingent on Ukraine's NATO accession moving forward. And there is a NATO meeting in Vilnius 1 month from now, or a little less than a month from now. I think it's July 11th. And that will be it'll be interesting, because by then we'll really be able to gain a clear picture of the counteroffensive. General Milley, Petraeus, they introduced this lie that Russia's offensive into Kiev, remember the initial offensive, the initial thrust, would succeed in 72 hours. And they did that in order to paint Russia as a failure. And now there's kind of another narrative claiming Ukraine has 72 hours to succeed. But I think the real figure that I'm seeing from hardcore pro-Ukraine supporters and the Ukrainian government itself is like 6 weeks. So by that time, there will be the NATO meeting, and it'll be interesting to hear what the ministers have to say there about Ukraine as Ukraine's NATO membership. But either way, Aaron, I think you're right. The NATOization of Ukraine will continue. And what do you think this means for the counteroffensive means for Biden? It seems to be one of the key planks of his re-election effort.
Yeah, well, check this out. This is from the Washington Post. This is how, like, they had this big article about the stakes of the counteroffensive for both the U.S. and Ukraine. And this is what they say about the U.S. And this is by Karen DeYoung, veteran Washington Post diplomatic correspondent. She writes this: as he heads into next year's re-election campaign, Biden needs a major battlefield victory to show that his unqualified support for Ukraine has burnished U.S. global leadership, reinvigorated a strong foreign policy with bipartisan support, and demonstrated the prudent use of American military strength abroad. So you notice how none of this has anything to do with defending Ukraine, right? The whole point, I thought, of arming Ukraine to the teeth is to defend it. But this is the Washington Post laying out Biden's real agenda for it, which is that it's to show strength, to show U.S. global leadership, a strong policy, and the prudent use of American military strength. It's all about the U.S. image, basically, and self-image and existence as a hegemon. That's what it's all about. And he needs this for his re-election campaign. That's how they see it. And I think she's capturing the thinking inside the White House. This has nothing to do with Ukraine or defending it or its well-being. This has to do with protecting U.S. supremacy. And Biden's basically hinging his re-election on it. And that's why he's not going to back down. But I don't think he's going to give Ukraine NATO membership because he knows that's a disaster for NATO, because that would bound NATO to fight directly with Russia, and Biden doesn't want that. The whole point of the NATO pledge was to bait Russia to help bring it into a war, to bleed it, but not to actually fight Russia directly. And so this dance will just keep going on, and the U.S. has locked itself in that ever since they gave Ukraine this promise back in 2008, which many people knew like they would never actually fulfill. But of course, because the U.S. can't back down because they want to show strength, it's just this endless loop of conflict and escalation with no resolution.
And last point, something very few have considered: when is Ukraine's next presidential election? It is spring 2024, and that could bring Zelensky down potentially. So
yeah,
that's another key date to mark down. I think it's the last weekend in March, according to the Ukrainian constitution. Zelensky has pretty much until then to show some major success. Otherwise, you could see the West backing someone else. If he's still alive by then, I assume he will be.
right.
I don't think he's going to go out like other former U.S. favorites like Manuel Noriega or Saddam Hussein. But there isn't a very good track record there.
Right.
So we'll keep following this story. Obviously, we're going to have to, but it'd be really interesting if we could get someone credentialed for the NATO meeting in Vilnius to ask some tough questions, because I don't know if the rest of the press is going to be doing that.
Yeah, we know someone who's going, so maybe we can get some questions posed there.